Okay, we're at the top of the hour and we're going to get started. Welcome everyone to the latest episode of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. As always, I am your host, Will Burns, and I serve as a co-director of the Institute. The Institute is focused on helping to define, facilitate and operationalize the notion of what constitutes responsible carbon dioxide removal. And one of the critical aspects of that definition of responsibility is the role and indeed the province of the public in deciding what kind of carbon removal they would deem to be acceptable and at what scale and over what time scales. And so the notion of developing effective community engagement is front and center, and we've seen the importance of that in a number of recent projects, sometimes ending well, sometimes ending badly, and so it's a top and center topic for us at the Institute. One of the things that I firmly believe is that reinventing the wheel when it comes to developing public engagement in the context of carbon removal is not a judicious approach. There's a lot to learn from other allied sort of projects. And of course, what we do in this community will help develop a scope of knowledge that will hopefully help in the future of other technologies. And so I'm really pleased today to have two experts on community engagement that have worked on what they denominate community centered engagement, including potential lessons learned for carbon dioxide removal. And so I want to first of all introduce our panelists for today. Aissa Deering, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, as well as the program manager on regenerative economy at the Sustain Our Future Foundation, and Molly James, who serves as a social science researcher and independent consultant. As always, we will utilize the format of an initial intervention by our panelists, followed by a couple of questions for myself to seed the conversation, and then we will proceed to audience questions. So I encourage you to start populating the Q&A box as soon as questions arise in your mind, so I have some sense of how long to allocate for that at the conclusion of the webinar. And with that, I will turn it over initially to Aissa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will, for having us. And thank you to the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal for all of the work that you've done in kind of ground setting this really important topic. Molly, if you could share your screen so we can get into the meat of things. Yeah, we're really excited to be spending time talking about community-centric approaches to CDR. Molly and I have been engaging at this nexus for the past couple of years, and we're excited to see the energy and excitement around this topic getting the attention it so well deserves. So let's get into it. Wanting to first take some time about how community-centric approaches to CDR have often been read as simply a means to achieve gaining a social license to deploy CDR technologies in a timely and rigorous fashion. Molly and I have seen and studied a spectrum of approaches from more light touch forms of community engagement like focus groups and town halls to even more deeper forms of ownership that are emerging. And we often talk about communities and CDR when we want to get them out of the way of CDR deployment to do this as quick as possible. And what we find is that this often replicates a dynamic that my boss, the CEO and founder of Sustain Our Future Foundation, calls sustainability as usual. And this perpetuates harm and intangible benefits for communities. What we see as community-centric CDR does is it invites relevant proximate stakeholders to inform and co-develop and own all stages of CDR deployment and monitoring in ways that provides communities benefits beyond workforce development and an increased tax base, and to really achieve environmental justice. So to talk a bit more about kind of what environmental justice is in the context of CDR and how it aligns with CDR to shape community engagement practices and outcomes. So, though the practice of environmental injustice in the US has existed since colonization, the term environmental justice itself was coined in the context of movements for racial and gender liberation in the 1970s. I'm sure many of you are environmental justice practitioners in this space, and is evidenced by the wide variety of definitions of environmental justice in the US context I wanted to offer here. The way Molly and I are thinking about environmental justice is way beyond a discourse or framework or a theory. It's really an ambition, a practice, and a dream. And according to the father of environmental justice, Dr. Robert Bullard, the lead author of the Toxic Waste and Race seminal reports, environmental justice embraces the principle that all communities, all people are entitled to equal protection of our environment, housing, transportation, civil rights, human rights, and health. And we can just see how holistic and expansive that definition is. Where environmental injustice has come into the picture is it's enabled the creation of sacrifice zones across the United States where toxicity and extraction harm communities. And our work is really to disrupt those systems that uphold this dynamic of privilege and oppression, NIMBYism, where some people are burdened for other people's benefits. As we've seen identified in the Lawrence Livermore Institute's Roads to Removals report, we've seen that industrial CDR in the US has significant already existing infrastructure in extractive geographies, particularly Central California and the Gulf South. And these are the same communities that have been burdened with oil refineries, fracking. These are the prime candidates for industrial CDR. Whereas we see that land-based carbon removal has prime biophysical conditions throughout the Southeast and the plains. These are the same places that are particularly awash with land grabbing from Black and Indigenous communities at the hands of mono-industrial agriculture and big timber. So these are the dynamics that we're seeking to disrupt. We know that this doesn't necessarily have to be the story of carbon removal as it's emerging so far. There's actually such significant learnings available from what's possible in the renewable space, and significant headway has been made around formalizing community benefits agreements and ways of ownership where communities can access land and facilities where renewables are sited. So opportunities go beyond this very mere light touch engagement with community groups to create bespoke models for community-driven and designed carbon dioxide removal. So in my engagement with community-based organizations, particularly in the Kern County footprint in Central California and across the Southeast, I've kind of seen that communities want to be the drivers of CDR. They're not closing the doors, but they want to be involved in these processes on their own terms and in alignment with their goals towards sovereignty, agency, and environmental justice. And community engagement that's often housed in maybe a carbon development firm or mediated through a carbon buyer or a corporate buyer, or even a large NGO, it sort of fails to oftentimes represent the interest of grassroots communities. So third-party mediation may be critical to kind of ensure trust, to ensure proper technical assistance resources are granted without a sort of behind-the-scenes agenda at play, and can ensure that communities can take full ownership in the ways that they best see fit in carbon dioxide removal deployment. And there are examples and organizations and frameworks that are doing this work. There's significant action from organizations like the National Indian Carbon Coalition. They've been in existence for decades, supporting tribes across the country and deploying forestry-based projects. The Ecosystem Services Market Consortium's Eco-Harvest program and their Regenerative Cotton pilot works with Black agriculturalists across the Southeast to understand how they can best work with philanthropic funders as well as cotton buyers to kind of instill regenerative practices on their land and make money from those practices. The Sustainable Forestry for African American Land Retention program is also supporting trying to create bespoke models for aggregation across forestry sites where land holdings may be smaller and cannot be viable for a singular carbon project, but perhaps together with very complex soil biogeochemical modeling, where do these possibilities exist to liberate capital and support land-based carbon removal development in ways that also supports land acquisition and retention for Black and Indigenous land stewards. And I think these organizations are particularly successful mediators because particularly between carbon firms, Indigenous nations, heirs property owners, Black agrarian and foresters, Black land stewards, generally speaking, because they solely represent the interest of the communities, and their role is to really hold these deep relationships and communities that they often have lived experiences in. For industrial CDR, it's kind of obviously a much different context. It might be critical here to spotlight mediators that can provide technical assistance to communities on the importance of these technologies to the Earth system, as well as how they may produce or reproduce benefits and burdens to proximate communities, as well as how communities can support their design and deployment. But these are very bespoke and kind of pilot phase engagement. So I'm excited to kind of dive into the learning so far in a conversation ahead. But for now, I'll pass to Molly to speak more granularly on her Teesside project.
Hello, thanks, Aissa. Yes, so I'm going to discuss my work from my role as research lead and community partnerships lead at a direct air capture company called Airhive. And I'll speak through how we've approached this in such a novel industry and how we've thought through these questions and how it's kind of evolved from the pilot project onto like bigger, more commercial projects in kind of different contexts. So direct air capture in an industrial cluster. This research study went alongside our pilot project located in Tees Valley, which is in the northeast of England. And because this pilot project was kind of very small, located inside a scale space, and it didn't really have the material footprint or climate relevance or social relevance to kind of do a grand old community partnership agreement, we decided to take the opportunity to run a public perception study and then alongside that generate principles for what the public constitute as socially responsible direct air capture deployment. And these principles will then later, I'll talk about how they informed our community partnership approach and how we're taking it forward. So yeah, our public perceptions work generated around 10 perceptions, but I'll touch on 3 that were particularly interesting. Firstly, the industrial appropriateness. So publics straight away interpreted direct air capture as a technology which would fit in their landscape. And what was exciting about it was that they had a lot of ideas and participants spoke about co-benefits for infrastructure and utility goals of the area. And similarly, there was an awareness of existing industry that needed to decarbonize, and there could be kind of co-benefits where an industry hosts direct air capture on their land, and there's some kind of prioritization for credits, and it will lead the whole area to decarbonize quicker and reach net zero. And so publics had a lot of ideas for the implementation in the area. And secondly, net zero ripple effects. So this, we saw the connotations around net zero impacting the perceptions of direct air capture arriving to the area. Net zero is very well known and highly politicized in the area. And there were connotations around it being overpromised and underdelivered, with jobs being outsourced and high costs, a kind of fantasy thinking around what would be possible, and it was actually seen as responsible for shutting old industry down. And then thirdly, with the arrival of direct air capture, we saw a conflation of CO2 with particulate pollution, which led to certain expectations around the health outcomes that direct air capture could bring to the area. And yeah, I think this represents a kind of confusion over the characteristics of CO2. And although we provided a kind of presentation and information pack on the technology, it is quite complex to get to grips with and requires, I guess, long-standing educational processes. And then as for the bottom-up generation of criteria for socially responsible deployment, firstly, democracy of information. We found that this was like the very foundation of the public's being able to reclaim democracy around industrial deployment. They want access to accurate, transparent information, which they can then make their mind up to as to whether they're going to attend a town hall or a consultation process or get involved or oppose it. So there needs to be firstly, an awareness and like research into the risks and benefits of the project, and then a way to accurately communicate this to local residents. Secondly, the public as stakeholders. Publics have a wealth of knowledge, and they saw their role as stakeholders in the processes that was not being recognised and was often kind of sidelined, and they kind of knew there was not being, they were engaged at a time where project characteristics could not be changed. So there needs to be a kind of, a greater recognition for the role of the public as an equal stakeholder in the process. Then thirdly, procedural involvement. These formal avenues, the public needed to be informed of kind of the key stages of project deployment and when they could attend and have their voice heard or ask questions and get answers. And then fourthly, socialized benefits and accountability. So this was quite an interesting one, and it's very reflective of the local context in this historic industrial cluster, where participants saw industry as having a civic responsibility to educate and hold open days and workshops, offer trainings and upskilling. And this was actually seen as being facilitated or held accountable through a partnership with the public sector. So with projects who were partnering with a university or receiving public funding, that kind of reassured our participants that there would be some kind of longevity to the process and some accountability if characteristics change or if there was some kind of injustice. Obviously, this is hugely context dependent in terms of the relation to industry and governing bodies and public bodies. And so following on from this research study, we are looking at like 4 commercial projects down the line and looking at how we can create a community partnership plan and approach. And so we are really thinking through these questions in real time. And I'm interested in what others say about these different things. There's a range of frameworks and approaches which can be used, and it will vary context by context. So our plan right now is to develop something flexible, which can be designed and changed context by context. And so we're looking firstly at the feasibility stage when we choose a site, and we're looking through the kind of utility and infrastructure and all the other kind of engineering aspects. We're then looking at a community needs assessment and an impact assessment and stakeholder identification to be done as early as possible to understand local dynamics and understand the strengths, resources, capabilities and needs of the local area, which then may lie in contrast or alignment to the proposed project. And an impact assessment can analyse issues such as land use, energy, water, distance to communities, noise, visibility. It can provide a holistic assessment across multiple dimensions. And then with this, we can start to envisage the way the project may interact with these systems and start asking questions such as how can the project characteristics contribute to the sovereignty goals of that community? And then throughout the project execution, there are numerous other stages which different frameworks and processes can be used. And it can depend on the project developer and what they're willing to concede. But it also requires rethinking about what is possible in this area. And so there are numerous different engagement channels, such as FAQ pages and partnerships and town halls, which can be built into the process. And there could be the creation of community engagement boards, or as Aissa talks about, mediators in the process. And yes, there are frameworks for the formalization then of agreements, partnerships, and monetary contributions or stakes. And so finally, project developers and other key actors in the systems should be asking themselves, what are you willing to concede? And so I'll leave it there. Thank you, and look forward to answering the questions that arise.
All right. Thank you very much to both of you, and I will just ask a couple of initial questions, and then we'll move to audience questions. Uh, One thing I'm curious about is if you expressly embrace a social license to operate model in terms of community consent, and if yes, what that looks like. Most specifically, let me give you a hypothetical. You have a proposed project, a CDR project, and the project has gone through the process of obtaining all requisite permits from government to proceed, whether it be for a research project or full-blown deployment. But it turns out that the community is resistant to that project, whatever way we define that, right? That in itself is difficult. But let's assume there's fairly substantial resistance to the project. Should the project under those circumstances move forward, and is that how you define social license to operate?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I think this is a huge question, especially talking to industry folks when there's such a stress and pressure around sorting capital, scaling up, choosing ideal locations, especially, yeah, my experience with direct air capture, the energy source, the storage source, there's like these huge fundamental operating questions about choosing a location, which are often, I guess, prioritized over, or at least come prior. There's a kind of hierarchy of licenses to gain. And so my experience with the social license term has been a kind of, as Aissa referred to, as seeing the community as an obstacle and just how can we achieve a social license? How can we get a rubber stamp on the development? Without, a neighbor listening to the community and recognizing that there might be legitimate concerns. And I think, within carbon dioxide removal, because of the aspect of removing carbon, kind of think that there is an inherent morality to the industry, whereas it can still reproduce historic injustices. It's not necessarily right. Specific instances, specific projects are not necessarily right. So there needs, I think social license, industry people are very keen on learning more about this field and understanding how can you get a social license, and it's not always that straightforward. So I think pushing for more of a two-way communication street and just recognizing that there might be legitimate concerns and projects could be changed.
Suppose industry doesn't want to change the project. Let's say it's been given the permits to proceed. Community says we don't want the project. Should the project proceed, or what should be the procedure at that point in terms of interaction with the community? Because I've already seen this happen in the CDR world, and I'm just curious what your model would embrace under those circumstances.
I'm happy to start on this question because I'm actually sort of dealing kind of with this exact scenario across a couple of different contexts. I think kind of uplifting what Molly said, I think this is why it's critical to engage relevant proximate community stakeholders in the planning process as CDR deployers are getting their regulatory licenses to operate. They should be engaging in communities as those approvals or disapprovals are coming through. Because as we well know, like EPA and DOE sort of standards to operate oftentimes don't incorporate the same sort of levels of risk mitigation that communities deserve. And the way that we're sort of dealing with, and I will say the sort of chart way forward isn't clear, and it's different context by context. We've been at Sustain Our Future Foundation, engaging with project developers, asking like, what are you willing to concede, as Molly kind of questioned throughout her presentation. I think that that question sort of fundamentally underlines community engagement, where there's just such significant resistance to industrial forms of development. We're seeing that profit sharing models have been appealing to communities. Community advisory board strategies, as Molly alluded to in her presentation as well, have been ways in which communities can have a form of accountability. Community benefits agreements, and not just community benefits plans, as the Department of Energy requires, but a legal document that can serve as a mechanism for accountability for communities. And I mean, there will always be tensions and difficulties. There will always be even disagreement among stakeholders in the community whether projects should go forward, if it's inevitable that they'll go forward. There have been quite physical disruptions by communities that have resisted CO2 pipelines as well. So I think, and it is difficult context by context, but I think this kind of scenario that you lay out, will kind of harks to why it's so important to engage communities as early as possible in these processes.
Do you think a CDR company that gets, again, it's hard to define, but a CDR company that gets a clear message from a community that it doesn't want a project to proceed, should proceed if it has the necessary permits? Do you think it would be illegitimate to proceed?
It's difficult to kind of speak to that in real terms, because I would say it does depend on the context. Um, yeah, I think Molly, I'm not sure if you have anything to contribute on this question of illegitimacy of CDR.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a very complex question, and yeah, hopefully there would have been processes in place before they gained the permits in other aspects. But we did see that in the UK with quite a well-known case with ocean alkalization with Planetary, and
Right.
they actually had conducted public consultation processes, but I think because of the size of them and publics had not heard of them and they didn't attend, and then it's only later on when the project materializes that opposition came, and it did end in the cancellation of the project. So I think it's really hard, and you can't predict public reaction, even if you have, say, done a consultation early on. But hopefully with the capacity to engage a wide range of stakeholders, engage them in the process throughout, it could be avoided. But generally, I think the public have a climate awareness and an interest in seeing carbon removal. And anyway, the publics I've talked of, if there's ways it can be made more safe, then the publics I've spoke to are interested in it arriving to their area, having a sense of pride over new industry. There's multiple other benefits and interests. If it is a safe project, and we've done that research and we've got that information, then I don't see that publics just oppose for no reason. And hopefully characteristics could be modified to make it more palatable, or some kind of agreement. But it's difficult.
All right, thanks. I'll ask one other question, and then we'll move to audience questions. One of the things that you adverted to early on in your presentation was co-development of the projects, and I saw some of the contours of that during your discussion. But you also talked about co-ownership, right? And I think co-ownership is probably a far more controversial and controverted proposition for a lot of companies, right? Do we have any empirical examples of that kind of successful co-ownership, not necessarily in the context of CDR? And what do you envision that would look like, and how would that be incorporated into this engagement process?
No, absolutely. I think there are a plethora of examples in the renewable energy space. Some that come top of mind are Microsoft's more recent engagements with virtual renewable energy power purchasing and working with community fund managers to ensure that um, not only create like a very bespoke model for community engagement that looks like very participatory grant making, but also ensuring that communities can stay actively involved in projects through community advisory boards and ensure consistent like profit sharing revenue streams to organizations deemed important and relevant for environmental justice action and policy promotion, if you will. I think in the CDR space, it is obviously a bit more novel. I would point to the National Indian Carbon Coalition and the work that they've been doing in facilitating, obviously, like land-based forms of carbon removal have such a more natural inclination towards community co-ownership. Land is, and stewarding land is just simply more convivial, it's more accessible. It is owned by the landholder. So we see the National Indian Carbon Coalition as well as other sort of carbon facilitators, if you will, supporting historically underserved land stewards and obviously retaining ownership over their land, ensuring that they are practicing sustainable land management practices to receive carbon credits for the forestry and soil carbon sequestration projects that they're putting forth, as well as utilizing a capital gained from these projects to further land acquisition of ancestral homelands, oftentimes. So while in the industrial CDR space, this is obviously a more novel concept, and I've seen a
Mhm.
lot of behind the scenes appetite from corporate buyers in particular, not necessarily project developers. Obviously, they have CapEx scores and shareholder returns to make, and
Right.
obviously profit revenues often like don't exist for the first few years of operation. Um, so it's still kind of like how do we tie that into perhaps advanced market commitments and other tools that corporates have been putting forth to ensure communities can receive some of those very tangible benefits outside of just the kind of typical workforce development and tax base increase. But those are some of the models that I've seen so far. I will also maybe put this in the chat as well. The New York University has a plethora of community benefits agreement resources. They have like a list of pretty much every known renewable energy community benefits agreement to date. And I believe there are a couple of community benefits agreements on CO2 pipelines, but nothing on industrial or land-based carbon removal development projects.
And
I'll
that's
try.
co-ownership of those pipelines themselves by the community, or
Not not necessarily. They more adjudicate revenues to communities as opposed to direct ownership of the project. I don't see a community advisory board, for example,
Mhm.
kind of governing those pipelines
Okay,
for
gotcha.
the examples I'm thinking. Yeah.
Great, thanks. All right, audience questions. There's two that are related to the methodology of the study. Both Karen Wolfgang and Aaron Clark were asking if the sample size of the study, which appears to be 10, was representative of the population and how you validated that criteria.
Yes, I just saw them. Apologies, this is a typo. So, yeah, my bad. I meant there was 10 perceptions generated of the study, and I touched on 3. The number of interviews was 50, which is a small sample size. We justified it because it was running alongside the pilot project. And so this included, there was 5 boroughs. So we split it by residency in the community and then demographics, generally getting a spread. So this was, alongside the pilot project, we justified it. And going forward, I think we would prefer, we plan a lot more greater capacity for community engagement for the commercial projects. But yeah, the pilot is a 1,000-ton system sitting within a bigger industrial facility. So it was just to firstly generate the initial public perceptions, because there'd never been done a study in this area, or even like a hyper-localized study on communities in the UK. So apologies about that.
Okay. All right. Question from, and again, as always, apologies if I mispronounce your name, Elena Chuni. Kind of related to that, how do you define community? Is there a certain radius you use? What's the process for getting them involved? I'm particularly interested in that latter question, right, about how you get them involved and how you ensure that you have a representative and not self-selected community, right? Of people who look like me that if they're retired have time on their hands, and working people and maybe poorer people would not be able to be involved.
Oh, absolutely. Happy to take a first stab at this question and hand it over to Molly. And hi, Elena. It's good to see you, and happy to see that we're engaging this space together. How we define community, depending on the project size and location, we typically look at a 25-mile radius of the project. If it's in a unincorporated geography, that's where that mileage kind of takes a real form. But if it is like within a county that has, local municipal system, that's kind of where we start engagement. We also before really getting involved in inviting communities to the process, we take a community needs assessment just around the environmental justice history of the region, whether there's like air quality struggles, if there's like a very rich legacy of extraction, mining in a particular community. We often find that there's very rich environmental justice infrastructure that has arisen around environmental justice issues. So we look to community-based organizations, as well as more kind of we kind of consider some community-based organizations folks that have like a more national footprint as grass tops. We really want to reach to the grassroots, looking at organizations like homeowners associations, public housing organizations, as well as youth groups as well. See how we can get different demographics involved, so we have a fairly equitable spread of folks that we're engaging with. And what those invitations look like, they can be email. We love to put boots on the ground, so folks, sometimes it takes form in like quite literal door knocking, letter sending, just ways to reach people through social media as well. Facebook, folks tend to be active on. So we try to get creative and deep. So we're really reaching like all sort of interested parties, and folks that even could be interested in CDR work, and invite them to lunch and learns, making spaces accessible, even like lunch or cookouts, CDR cookouts. I think we should do some CDR cookouts. I'm gonna say that. And really have food, transportation stipends available, just easy, accessible, safe places for communities to gather and talk about CDR concerns, and maybe have like a technical assistance facilitator kind of walk through the project specs and support communities in understanding like what this particular industry in their area, what are the potential benefits, what are the potential harms, and what can you ask for as a stakeholder in this project. I hope that provides an overview of kind of Sustain Our Futures process and kind of what I've been doing in my research. But Molly, happy to pass it to you if you have further thoughts on how you define community.
Yeah.
No, that was amazing.
Maybe one follow-up question on that. Did you think in this study that at the end of the day you were able to address that bedeviling question of getting the usual characters, right? The folks that have plenty of time on their hands, but aren't necessarily wholly representative of the community. Did you think you got a good cross section in the end?
Well, I can spend a bit on this question and pass to Molly to talk specifically about her study. But we find that when engaging with communities, there's often community-based organizations that like operate in a very hyper-localized way. I'm thinking specifically in kind of what the engagement we've been doing in Central California, the Central California Asthma Collaborative, the Central California Environmental Justice Network, the Rising Sun Center for Opportunity. There are organizations that are already engaging in particular communities of color, low income communities on CDR deployment. So I do think kind of working through some of those kind of key stakeholders who often have like lived experience that they're working in the area and can like reach residents. I think it makes a lot of sense, and we find that kind of working through that environmental justice infrastructure means that we can reach folks that may not otherwise would be able to be reached, if that makes sense. And
Mm-hmm.
I'll pass to Molly to talk about the study.
Yeah, I was kind of going to reiterate, yeah, the kind of having that initial stakeholder identification phase and then branching out from that. That certainly helped us. We interviewed about 20 local civil society organizations operating and who knew the very local context, and then we reimbursed participants and yeah, kept initial kind of engagement quite short. But I think, yeah, building out from that network and identifying key stakeholders at the beginning definitely helped us in that regard, but it's still a difficult question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important. One of the things I've seen in a lot of the frontier applications, for example, I'm on the advisory committee for that, are startups that will, hold community fora, but because they haven't engaged with key stakeholders that might be able to identify and motivate people to attend that are important, they end up with in my opinion, a non-representative sort of cross section, and then are surprised at the end of the day when there's lots of community resistance still to the projects, right? And people that perspectives they didn't hear from, right? Because I think these community fora often don't capture that unless you've done that groundwork, right? That foundational work, right? So I think that's a really important point you make there. Here's a very broad, challenging question from an anonymous attendee. How can we navigate rational, I'm going to put that in quotes because I guess we'll have to define it, rational community concerns and desires, such as will CO2 leak? Will this increase the tax base, from quote irrational ones such as conspiracy thinking, denial of climate change, excessive payment demands? Are different approaches needed for each? Who determines what's rational and what's not? Right? That's a really interesting question about the contours of democracy, right? And what concerns count, quote unquote, and what don't count in making decisions. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, just quickly, I think what comes to mind is the process that you choose to get these responses. And I've been working a bit on deliberative democracy and those kind of extended processes. And I think that's what works in the favor, is that you do need this kind of long educational or information phase where you have either different experts or different disciplines, and you really set carbon removal within climate change and net zero, and take the time to bring in different disciplines, different perspectives, and set the groundwork, and then have time for publics to deliberate and come to answers. And I think, starting from a position of, hopefully people will have certain legitimate concerns, but definitely there is a conspiracy or opposition to carbon removal because of its place in even kind of environmental people seeing carbon removal as a distraction, or that it's going to perpetuate extractive activities. So definitely a concern, but I think working on these processes, providing more information and greater space for deliberation and to provide a plurality of responses hopefully helps.
I
Anything to add with that,
completely.
Isa?
Oh, yeah, thank you, Will. No, I completely uplifting what Molly said. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the deployment of the COVID vaccine around like justified mistrust of science and innovation and how to best engage communities in offering information that can support their rational decision making around their bodily autonomy as well as like kind of what is developed in their backyards. I think what I found in my research endeavors, I think community workshops around sustainable development, very
Hmm.
broadly speaking, like not framing them in terms of carbon removal, but offering it as an option and offering education on kind of what carbon removal does is really critical. And it allows communities to engage with carbon removal kind of on their own terms, as opposed to attending maybe a workshop or a lunch and learn that is specifically oriented around carbon removal. So we've done like broader sustainable development workshops where we're like, how do you imagine sustainability in your community, broadly speaking? And we often
Hmm.
find that stakeholders who deny climate change will not be at these workshops. Um, so perhaps there is that question of like, how can we even step back from even those processes to see how we can get communities perhaps at the margins involved, or maybe they might not want to be involved and don't have a perspective that they'd like to share. I've seen that as well. So kind of framing it in terms of sustainable development and walking through different options for carbon removal, water replenishment, biodiversity have really supported communities in their thinking around infrastructure deployment in their own backyards. But yeah, uplifting what Molly said around what does it mean to even extend that and step back? It is a very difficult question. So appreciate folks who are asking, and I'm excited to see all these comments or questions in the Q&A.
Oh
Very
yeah,
exciting.
we get a good community for these issues as we should. One of the things I wanted to amplify that Molly said, because it's music to my ears, is thinking about more extended and structured deliberative processes like citizen juries and worldwide views that ASU, Arizona State University, has developed. I think would really benefit this community, and we don't do much of that, right? It's expensive, it's messy, but I think it really would help uh, to uh, to develop more cohesive sort of discussions of carbon removal than just holding a 2 hour public fora, right, where you make a 10-minute presentation and say, what do you think? Right. I think those are pretty artificial. So if there's people on this in this audience, including the speakers that are looking to develop more of that, we're definitely interested in thinking more about that. Next question from Nick Yoon. It says, you mentioned that in your public perception sample, there was a conflation of direct air capture removing CO2 with removing particulate pollution. If when you clarified that DAC only removes CO2, how did this impact public perception of DAC, such as did this reduce interest in the technology? It's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is interesting. And it has this result came up in a few other studies as well. So I think,
Mhm.
I mean, going back to the extended process, you really do need a lot more time to talk about, I mean, just set the scene with the characteristics of CO2. And I have seen kind of industry muddying the waters around this, talking about how you kind of cleaning the air and how it may have some inadvertent effects on other pollutants. Anyway, that's a tangent, but it is really important that we set the line straight with this and are able to communicate clearly whether it will have inadvertent benefits or risks to local air pollution and other pollutants. As for what the public thought, so we didn't really get a chance to clarify in the study because it was a research study and we didn't really want it to turn into a Q&A. We had like a semi-structured format, and we
Mhm.
provided the same information to everyone. And I guess that is, how we've got this quite strong result on the conflation at the end. But yeah, we basically asked about hopes and concerns and what kind of kind of balanced questions, but kind of trying to tease out these things. And the local context in Tees Valley has, a history of injustices around air pollution, and they're even colloquially, the people who live there still call themselves smoggies because of the amount of smog, which is, it's crazy. So I think it's very understandable that that was very close to their hearts in terms of the health outcomes that this could bring to the area. But it has been seen in other cross UK, cross US perception study by Emily Cox. So yeah, sorry, we didn't see how that influenced their interest in technology.
All right. So two questions that are related, one by Selena Scott Buchler and another by an anonymous attendee, which is essentially, how do you know you've successfully measured support or opposition? Selena was suggesting, is it by majority rule, individual veto? And the anonymous attendee was using, percentages, right? 4% is mildly supportive, 1% is vocally opposed. How do we determine what counts, right, as opposition, right? Invariably, there's always someone for probably any project that hates it, right? But when is there enough of that sort of opposition? And I guess at what level of saliency that we deem there to be substantial, maybe support or opposition? Yeah, I know it's a tough one to grapple
Okay.
with. Go for it.
Um,
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer.
yeah, don't think I've got a percentage for you. But no, it is very interesting, and especially depending on how many people you've engaged in the capacity of the project. Um, yeah, it's super difficult to know. I think with our study generating public perceptions and principles for responsible deployment, we didn't really try to get a yes, no, or like, I guess, get the rubber stamp on social license. And I think that's why I'm slightly apprehensive about this kind of term, because you never like gain a social license. It could be taken away from you at any time as the project changes or as different publics emerge and as different things become apparent. So it's not really possible. You can't predict a reaction or an outcome especially when you start early. But through, I guess, just repeating what we have highlighted with the feasibility study and with a range of stakeholders, and then the kind of, someone else asked about the community engagement board and what the role is for that, and identifying those key stakeholders, you've then got this kind of you've got a process in place, whereas people know where to go, and that they're kind of the intermediaries and vocal points for communities to go to. And I think that way you can maybe gain a better idea. And as for like if they're actively opposing it, like Will asked earlier, similarly, like, I guess this is why it's kind of interesting thinking through the kind of partnership or ownership questions, is that if a community is apprehensive, or like, what are they apprehensive about? If they're apprehensive or opposing a certain aspect, like, can the safety be improved? Can it be made into a sustainable, safe project? And then if it's still causing disturbance and visible or noise pollution, then does kind of having a stake in the process and rethinking the governance of it, does the governance change that kind of perception of the project and acceptance?
All right. Next question from Bonnie Benawal. Can you talk about geologic storage safety for communities and pore space ownership? Is that something that arose in what you were looking at?
I can speak on the first part, and maybe Aissa knows more about the kind of ownership and the pipeline aspect. But I did a project on the kind of geological storage, and even actually with this perception study of direct air capture, the publics want to know about the fate of carbon, and actually the perceptions of the storage aspect is significantly more negative than the capture or the transport of it. Um,
Hmm.
it's quite unintuitive, like where the carbon is being stored. I think a few
Mhm.
people thought it was in tanks or in vessels under the ground. A few people didn't understand kind of where it was going. And I think the safety, especially in the UK, we've had loads of fracking controversy, and that has impacted perceptions of all subsurface activities, regardless of whether you're in that location of fracking or not. It was very, very strong. So the storage aspect, is very significant. And I think in the UK, we're prioritizing offshore storage. And in terms of the health risk for the asphyxiation of CO2, and the ocean acting as a kind of buffer for that, the leakage is purported to be very small if a leakage event was to occur. The health impacts could be very hazardous if on land. Offshore, comes with its own risks. But perceptions tend to be better offshore. But storage is still a very big sticking point, even when you're only looking at the kind of capture aspect. So
And to be completely transparent here, we haven't really engaged with, or at least in my research and practitioner work, with the concept of like pore space ownership.
Mhm.
We've more been thinking about ownership in the ways of finance, in the ways of like profit sharing models, in governance through community advisory boards and other means, and like kind of procedural involvement, but not necessarily like poor space ownership in it of its own right, in the same way that you would like own a plot of land or own well water. And I don't imagine community, and I don't want to speak for folks, but I don't imagine folks would be interested in poor space ownership in it of its own right, but more so that they can sort of dictate and hold facilities accountable for ensuring, safe and sustainable operations of their facility. Because I can't imagine like carbon and pore space having much use as a kind of intangible asset to communities that they can buy, sell, or trade. It's more so that they just want to be involved in the process, if that makes sense.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Emily Cicchini, who on the project team takes the lead on community engagement? Is it more engagement experts, communication scholars, project developers?
I'm happy to speak a bit to this one. It does depend, but oftentimes I've found a lot of success in third-party mediators. These are NGOs as well as like kind of carbon intermediaries at times, like the National Indian Carbon Coalition, that
Mhm.
can hold those deep relationships with particular contexts and geographies, whilst kind of mediating on behalf of the community in the interest of the community, trusted by the community, to kind of facilitate and bring these projects over the finish line. I imagine that often, even sometimes, there have been instances where community-based organizations that are proximate to the projects kind of want to take that role and want to facilitate community benefits process. Like we're seeing that in Central California with the
Mhm.
Central California Environmental Justice Network wanting to really facilitate a collaborative space for historically underserved communities across Kern and the San Joaquin Valley, and to facilitate CBA processes. But I guess it all depends, really. I'm not sure, Molly, if you've seen anything different or had any further insight on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's yet another interesting question, right? And I think there is some research that indicates the communities deem it more credible, right, to have a third party as opposed to a project developer in that role. So it's an interesting thing for project developers to tease out, right? And it's a bit of a trade-off of some loss of autonomy, right? But perhaps better community engagement. So thanks for the question. We have reached the top of the clock yet again, and I want to first of all thank Aissa and Molly for excellent presentation and some great discussion, and our audience, right? I think we really nerded out on a community engagement in this one, which is what I hope we're going to do, because it's just a critical question, right? From a standpoint of the integrity of these projects and facilitating good projects, and obviously an ongoing sort of process. But I think we outlined some really good questions here for moving forward. So thanks to everyone. We will be back tomorrow with another edition of the webinar focusing on the state of the job market in CDR. So if you're interested in that, please join us. Pre-registration is required, and then otherwise we'll have a couple more episodes in October. And with that, I will say goodbye.